This video, we're going to talk about some problems with Germanic paganism. Now, I don't consider myself a Germanic pagan anymore, or really even a pagan. Solar idealism is something beyond that, a solution that I came up with to address some of the issues that I had with Germanic paganism after practicing it and exploring it for several years. But because, I have the tattoos, and I've mentioned it in some of my books, and some of my readers have come to me through Germanic paganism and things that I was doing when I was in that period, I felt like it would be a good time to take a deep dive into some of the problems with Germanic paganism and say why I am no longer part of that and why I moved into solar idealism. And I want to say that I don't really care what you do. I'm not trying to talk you out of something. If you're doing something that works for you, that's fine. Humans are tribal animals. I'm very pro-human and very pro-human nature. And I want to see all kinds of different tribes of people doing all kinds of different things. So if you're into that and it's working for you, just do that. That's fine. The real problem that I see in the world are these kind of globalist, universalist religions that claim to have a lock on objective truth for everyone, everywhere. And I think that those are the most anti-human religions because humans are tribal animals. And they inevitably have to employ coercion and manipulation to push everyone into conformity, into their little box. You see that with the big monotheistic religions, and you see that now with the new woke Gnostic religion. If you're not allowed to dissent from it, everybody has to be in it, in the Borg, or they can't feel okay with themselves. They feel like it has to be their destiny, that everybody has to agree with them, everyone in the entire world. All right, so a little bit about my background. Why is my opinion on this worth anything? And you may still think that it's not, and that's okay too. I joined a folkish heathen tribe around 2014, and I left around 2018. So I was in a leadership position, a priest role, and I conducted Germanic pagan rituals every month during that time. And I participated in events, and I did things with other groups. I bought land, and I built temples to Odin and Thor and Tyr, and I had an altar to Frey. And after I left the group I was in, I kept performing rituals with Germanic themes until I finished writing Fire in the Dark and created Solar Idealism, and eventually sold the land and moved on. I actually sold the land to my friend Clint McMillan, and he still does rituals there. He does rituals specifically to Thor, which has kind of always been his thing, and he's done tons of research on that subject and is really, really knowledgeable about it. So, doing all of this required a lot of reading and a lot of research and a lot of memorization of texts and of Old Norse passages of things and study of the runes and all those kind of things. I've also interviewed Stephen Flowers or Edred Thorsson, and I've watched Stephen McNallen run a ritual, and I've met him, and I've interviewed and been interviewed by guys like Brute Norse and Matthias Nordvig. And later, when I talk about the intersection between Germanic paganism and Satanism, know that I was actually an ordained priest in the Church of Satan for a few years back in the 2000s. Now, that's almost 20 years ago, and it's not who I am or a recent thing. But just know that, yes, I have met the high priests and priestess of the Church of Satan, and I have performed satanic rituals with Satanists. So I do have a fairly substantial frame of reference for what that is as well. Problems with Germanic paganism. Part one is our ancestors, our blood, and the scene. So I was drawn to Germanic paganism because I was writing about tribe and identity and orientation in the world. And I was, like so many other men, asking, who is my tribe? Who are my people? So I was raised Catholic, but I never really had any connection to it. And I was from Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Dutch country, Deutsch country. And I had a very German background, although my paternal line is actually English. So, and this seems to be the case, and this is a big problem with a lot of the Americans who are interested in Germanic or Norse paganism. Most of them are more English and German than Scandinavian. And most of the primary sources related to Germanic paganism, like the Eddas and the sagas, are of Scandinavian origin. Germanic pagans address this by saying that the Scandinavian sources are echoes of a much older Germanic tradition. And they cite folklore and the progression of language and Roman sources like Tacitus's Germania. which offer some descriptions of practices and beliefs of the Germanic tribes that predate the Vikings that everyone associates with Norse paganism and Asatru. Of course, the reality is that Tacitus never actually traveled to Germania himself. And he worked with second-hand accounts, so his actual understanding of the practices of Germanic tribes is questionable. It's very likely that he put his own political spin on the subject, as the work was meant for the Romans of his time and not for 21st century neo-pagans. The ancient Germanic people were very tribal. And there is every reason to believe that different tribes held very different beliefs. And you can see that even in Tacitus's work. All we really have are bits and pieces of artifacts and scattered accounts and linguistic correlations. That's about it. So I traveled to some ancient pagan sites in Germany, including Opfermorvogtei, which is the largest Iron Age cult site in Central Europe, with findings dating to the 6th century BC through the 5th century CE Migration Age. While very interesting, not much has been found there that seems to line up with anything approaching modern Asatru, aside from a certain primitive pagan aesthetic, je ne sais quoi. The site is actually associated with Proto-Celtic Hallstatt culture, but it's right in the middle of Germany. So again, what and who is actually Germanic? Where does Celtic end and Germanic begin? And the answer is it's not very clear. There's a lot of intermingling of ideas and so forth historically. And another question is, why is it so important to these Americans with English and German and Scots-Irish ancestry to focus on the Germanic pagans, whose literature comes from Scandinavia? The reality is that men want to worship gods that look like them, men who look like higher and more powerful versions of themselves. The gods described in the Eddas and sagas had red and brown beards and pale skin, and they wielded hammers and axes and spears. They spoke to ravens and eagles and wolves. They were aesthetically relatable to Western European men. And what's more, they were manly gods, powerful, muscular gods who fought battles and wanted to die by the sword and go to Valhalla. And that is the appeal for most men attracted to Germanic paganism. Manly gods and manly gods who look like them. And that was a huge part of the attraction for me. And I don't really think that there's anything wrong with that. The problem with gods who look like me is that there is a big connection there to being white. Not German or French or Danish or Swedish, but white. Race is the only real connection there. The actual history is all over the place. There's no way to determine what any man's blood ancestors actually believed over 1,000 years ago. And unless his ancestors inbred for the past 1,000 years, which would probably make him ugly and deformed at best, there's every reason to believe that his blood ancestors believed all kinds of different things and worshipped many different gods 1,000 years ago. What we can be sure of is that almost all of them worshipped Jesus Christ for the past 1,000 years. Whether you like it or not, that's what's true. So why those gods? Odin, Thor, and Frey, whose cults, to the extent that they were even very similar, died out almost 1,000 years ago. Why not the gods of ancient Rome or Greece? Because they also look like us. And the answer is that a lot of the romance of the Germanic gods is wrapped up in late 19th century nationalism. That's just my theory, but I also think that was in part an early response to the crisis of meaning that Nietzsche called the death of God. Again, people were like, where is meaning? Who am I? Where do I fit into the world? Who are we? And of course, 19th century Germanic nationalism and racial mysticism fed into Nazism and what is now called white nationalism. It's all kind of a big continuous mess. It was determined by some that those gods, the Odin, Thor, Frey, etc., those were the true gods of our people, meaning white people. And, I first started my journey through Germanic paganism by joining a group that self-described as folkish, which meant that they believed that they had a blood connection to the gods of the Eddas. And on the surface, it made sense to me at the time that if you're going to be Germanic pagans, you should at least be Germanic, right? So, I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. As I've said above, now that seems fairly arbitrary to me, but and we'll get into my opinions on the Eddas in a little bit here. But one of the big problems with Germanic paganism is that when you meet another Germanic pagan, not just some guy who has rune tattoos or who thinks that Vikings are rad, but a practicing Germanic pagan, a Norse pagan, or Astruar, or self-described heathen, whatever you want to call them, there is an 80% chance that at some point he's going to want to talk about his problems with blacks or Jews. They just feed into each other. It's not always the case, but it very often is. And, if he says he's an Odinist, make that 95%, because that's a very specific branch of that thing. He's probably going to believe in some kind of blood connection to the ancestors and his ancestral gods, and he's going to believe that people in his group should make white babies to keep that connection pure. And that's kind of those things all feed into each other, like I said. So it's really difficult to separate modern Germanic paganism from neo-Nazism. There is a lot of softening language around these groups that help them pass under the cultural radar, or at least there used to be. These days, I see them being more open about it because there's basically two versions of this. There's the kind of hippie Wiccan version of it, where people have trans flags and whatever, but they worship Thor and Odin. And then there's white nationalists. So very little in between. There are groups that are in between. I think Matthias Nordvig would be a good example of that. The things that he talks about, he's neither of those things really, but he's also actually Scandinavian. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So it's really difficult to separate Germanic paganism from neo-Nazism. But and the truth of it is, most of these groups are actually pretty harmless, from what I've experienced about them. Unless they're in prison or something, they're not going out and attacking other racial groups. In fact, they are more likely to be targeted by anti-racist groups and anti-racist organizations who really need them to exist so that they can exist. Like knowing if you have a group like the SPLC, like they need Nazis. They will find them under a rock somewhere because they need to make people believe that that's still a problem. And I believe in freedom of speech and freedom of association. Always have. That's always been kind of the core of my personal beliefs. Even though I've changed many beliefs over the years, I do believe that people shouldn't be forced to choose their friends. You should be able to hang out with whoever you want to hang out with, and associate with whoever you want to associate with. And that doesn't mean that you believe all the things that they believe. And you should be able to say and think and explore ideas, because otherwise you're just following. So I'm very much not that guy. So I realize the importance of having to be able to work through ideas and try different things and figure things out, and kind of go on a journey yourself. So, I believe that the world should be full of all kinds of groups with whom I don't necessarily resonate or agree. So if these groups if they believe that they're magically connected to Odin or Thor from 1,000 years ago, it's really not that much more ridiculous than any other religion. Most religions can be made ridiculous pretty quickly. So it is what it is. But personally, in my own life, I would much rather associate with an accomplished man of another race who shares my values and my interests than I would be limited to a group of white guys jerking themselves off about their noble ancestors and complaining about other races. Sifting through hundreds of these wannabe Vikings to find a few reasonable, high-speed guys who resonate with those stories just isn't, and it wasn't and isn't worth my time. There was one of the most frustrating things about being part of groups like that. It's like, I see 15 guys who are a little bit brown or a little bit like something else. And, they're cooler than these guys that I'm stuck with. They've got more going for them. And so that's, that was very frustrating to me. So I just can't be bothered with groups that are that attached to a racial background or ethnicity. Not at this time, not in 2023. It's just not worth my time. I will add here that I think Europeans have a different level of connectivity to these myths. And, sometimes they might have different and more legitimate reasons for claiming them as part of their heritage. If you grew up passing rune stones and ancient sites in or around places referred to in these stories, that's a little different than, it's less desperate than reaching across thousands of miles and hundreds of years to connect with a tiny piece of your ancestral religion. If you've lived your entire life inhabiting the landscapes described in these stories, you have different reasons, and it's a different thing. So I'm very sympathetic to that as well. The European situation is very different from the American situation. Americans are very disconnected from their European backgrounds in most cases, and you can't that connection is broken. You can't just remake it. You're not going to become German. If you're from Pennsylvania or Ohio or whatever, you may have some German background, but you're not just magically German. You go to Germany, you'll find that out really quickly. You may look a little bit like those people, and you might like beer, but you're not German. You're American if you've grown up in America. But anyway, I think it's a forced connection. So the Europeans have a different situation, but I still think that if you're over there and you're trying to pursue these ideas, I still think you're going to run into talking to a lot of guys who are just kind of waiting for an opportunity to say Hitler did nothing wrong. So it is what it is. So when people practice Germanic or Norse paganism, they are pulling most of their mythic material from the poetic and prose Eddas. There are some who dig deeper and look for other sources, but the Eddas tend to be the central point of reference. Now, I spent a lot of time with the Eddas and the stories in them, and I think there's a lot of value in those stories, but too many pagans treat the Eddas as if they were some kind of Bible or holy scripture, and they're not. They were never meant to be. The Eddas are a collection of folklore assembled and written down by Snorri Sturluson, who was a Christian. Almost 200 years after people in the region had, at least officially, converted to Christianity. The Eddas were never meant to be religious texts. They were never widely used as religious texts until the 20th century. This is important because I have watched modern neo-pagans and heathens cite lines and verses of the Eddas and argue about the meanings of passages the way that Christians argue about the Bible, as if it were a holy book whose words come directly from Odin himself. The words came from a Christian. And while I'm not an expert on Snorri, if you look up information about his life, you can see that there are a lot of reasons why he might have skewed things one way or another. My friend Clinton McMillan has done tons of research on this and has more or less convinced me that the most common Germanic pagans, to the extent that that means anything at all, probably worshipped Thor as their primary god, and that Odin was a late or secondary figure. Now, that's controversial, and it may or may not be true. But is Clinton right? I don't know. But no one else does either. Not definitively, and they never will. And this actually fits the Indo-European pattern fairly well. The king of the gods tends to be a thundering storm god, not a strange traveling magician or shaman, not a Merlin figure, which is kind of what Odin really is. But that said, Snorri's folklore about Odin is still great. The Havamal still contains a ton of wisdom. Myths are stories that have something to say about human nature and the human experience. And I think that the stories about Odin have a lot to teach us. There are all kinds of books about the runes, and they tend to lend themselves to all kinds of mysticism. But you can find almost everything that is actually known about the Younger and Elder Futhark runes on Wikipedia. The meanings attributed to the runes come from the Anglo-Saxon, Norwegian, Icelandic, and Swedish rune poems. And those poems tend to be vague, and the meanings assigned to the runes often conflict. There are no extant primary sources assigning meanings to the Elder Futhark runes, like these. So all the meanings assigned to them are essentially guesses, or extrapolations, or connections from the other rune poems. I say this as someone who has them tattooed on my knuckles. Based on what heathens and Germanic pagans attribute to the runes, I selected runes that I associated with the 4 tactical virtues from the Way of Men. There's nothing wrong with assigning our own meanings to symbols. That's what humans do, and that is what symbols are. In fact, if there was some kind of meaning beyond A is for apple and B is for boy, attributed to these symbols in any widespread way in ancient times, it was because someone, somewhere, assigned that meaning to them. Unless, of course, you literally believe that Odin discovered the meaning of the runes while hanging on a tree for 9 long, windy nights. That's a good story. And it's one that was, and I would say actually is still very meaningful for me. I still know the Old Norse to it. I've said it so many times. But to me, it's just a beautiful and symbolic myth. Even though I don't necessarily believe that there is any mystical origin to the runes because I spent so much time with them, I can still use them as compact symbols that indicate a much bigger meaning, which is really what the charm of them is. I mean, you have, this little drawing, and it means this bigger thing. And especially people who meditate on the runes and they think about what these cryptic lines in the rune poems mean. If you do that for long enough, this meaning gets very big for you. This little symbol that means all these things. You have imagery attached to it. And it's very, very powerful. And that going through that process actually taught me a lot about humans and symbols and religion and our imaginations and how powerful that is for people. So, if the runes mean something to you, I don't really see any reason to do away with that, as long as you have a realistic understanding of their origin and the history surrounding them. Beyond that, you can figure out what makes sense to you. All right, people are going to hate this. Germanic neo-paganism is a new age religion. It is. It's mostly created in the 70s and 80s. It's a new thing. It's not an ancient thing. In Fire in the Dark, I talked about fire as a metaphor for culture and orientation and meaning. There are these stories of eternal flames maintained by numerous cultures which were not truly eternal, but which are kept burning until the culture itself was exhausted. The sacred fire of Vesta in ancient Rome is a well-known example. We don't actually know what your ancestors or my ancestors actually believed 1,000 years ago. But what we do know is that they stopped believing it. That fire went out a long time ago. Now, there was a wave of interest in Germanic paganism in the late 19th and early 20th century, and a lot of the romantic art was made by people rediscovering long-forgotten myths. And that's the period where people were drawing imagery of gods like Odin or Thor, up until Marvel's Thor, and then you have a bunch of heavy metal album covers. And then there was this recent boom in art related to Norse mythology that followed the release of that, the television show, The Vikings. So Stephen Flowers, who is one of the primary figures I would credit with the resurgence of Germanic paganism in the late 20th century, actually wrote a book about the historical waves of interest in Germanic mythology titled The Northern Dawn. Stephen Flowers, who also writes as Edred Thorsson, was a founding member of several Germanic neo-pagan groups, and he's written numerous books detailing rituals and meditations and yogic practices and so forth involving the runes and Germanic gods of the Eddas. I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing him over lunch in Austin several years ago. Stephen is an interesting character, and I learned a lot from him. He's always thorough and honest about his sources, and I don't think he's trying to con anyone. He's actually very inspiring to me. He knows better than anyone that there really isn't much source material describing the actual rituals or practices of people who believed in the Aesir or the Vanir. So he worked with what he had and borrowed from what he knew about rituals from other magical traditions to envision ways for people to practice this new version of Germanic paganism. I don't blame him for doing this, and I know that I have performed rituals modeled after his rituals. In fact, I find what he accomplished very inspiring because it shows what is possible for solar idealism. and the creation of meaning and new ritual forms. I don't think Stephen Flowers intended to deceive anyone. He's also written books suggesting how one might worship Ahura Mazda and practice Persian magic. He's clear that he is reformulating practices. But many people approach things from a surface level, and they tend to assume that the practices he described were the very same ancient ones that our Viking ancestors practiced. And that can't be the case because we don't have that information. The Germanic neo-pagan rituals that people are practicing today are essentially a new religion, a new age religion, much like the Celtic and Wiccan counterparts that emerged in the 20th century in the empty spaces left as Christianity receded, when people were looking for something new. Now, there's nothing wrong with a new religion. Every religion was once new. It's just important to be conscious of what you're investing and participating in. Germanic paganism, black metal, and black magic. A lot of people come to Germanic paganism from or through Satanism or black metal. And it makes a lot of sense. You know, if they were conformists, they'd be Christians or they'd be woke neo-communists. A lot of people who find themselves attracted to Germanic or Norse paganism are questioners and nonconformists, or people who see themselves as outsiders in some way. I also fit that description. I never liked black metal, but I obviously dabbled in Satanism and forbidden ideas and a darker aesthetic. So you have all these guys who were into metal and stories about giants and the grim north and witchcraft and trolls, who spent years wearing corpse paint and black outfits and covering themselves with skulls and bones and listening to music about death and doom. Of course, some of it is also about bravery and heroism. You have things like Man-O-War, and there are also themes like that running through a lot of things. But a lot of it is very dark. And there is a huge overlap with upside-down crosses in Satanism and black magic. When those guys move into Germanic paganism, as they very often do, they bring all of that with them. And it has been a major influence on that culture as a whole. I also mentioned Stephen Flowers earlier and the influence he's had on rituals that were practiced and are practiced in Germanic pagan circles. Well, Stephen Flowers, or Edred Thorsson, is also a member of the Temple of Set, a satanic organization. And I think that a lot of those rituals were influenced by occult practices. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are bad, but I think that it's something that you should look at and consider. Several years ago, after performing a ritual in which I sacrificed a goat, one of the men present asked me if what I did wasn't just Satanism. And that certainly wasn't what I meant to be doing. I was trying to do something that was very positive. I wasn't trying to do Satanism. But I did start looking at what I was doing and the aesthetics of it. Why is there so much death here? Why so much blood and bones? Why does everything seem to be spooky and scary and dark and witchy? Why does it look like black magic? Where is all this coming from? And how much of it is built into the structure of the rituals? So I started to look at everything and I tried to identify what I considered to be black magic and pull it out of what I was doing. Death obviously has a place in any positive solar culture, but that place shouldn't be at the center. The center of a positive solar culture should be light. So I pulled out all the bones and the black, and I pulled out as much of the death as I could. And I started doing rituals at golden hour instead of late at night. But I also held on to some of the elements that I thought were wholly positive. A lot of Germanic pagans actually practice a toasting. A lot of Germanic pagans actually practice a toasting round after ritual. They usually call it symbol or something like that. And it was always really positive and uplifting. And we still do an adapted version of that in the Order of Fire. We call it the Holy Round. So this critique of Germanic paganism led me to where I am now with Solar Idealism. And that's also why I am very clear on why certain things and certain aesthetics don't fit in with what we're doing in the Order of Fire. I see them and I recognize them and I know where they are from. When I see a black sun, I just see neo-Nazi Satanism. I know that most guys see the Ægishjálmur or the Vegvisir, and they think Vikings, Odin, Thor, fuck yeah. And That's what they mean when they put the stickers on their trucks or get the tattoos like I did. But when I see those symbols now, I just see Icelandic black magic and Hail Satan. If you really want someone to piss in your cornflakes about those symbols, go read Brute Norse's brutal deep dive into it, titled Clubbing Solomon's Seal, The Occult Roots of the Ægishjálmur. But the final straw for me with Germanic pagans was that the Germanics misgendered the sun. Their sun is female, and that just doesn't sit well with me. Can't have that. No wonder their whole thing is about being doomed. That's what happens when you misgender the sun. Doomed. I'm kind of kidding and kind of not, but I thought I'd wrap this up on a humorous note. Anyway, I hope you got something out of this video and learned something, or it made you think, or maybe you just understand where I'm coming from a little bit better. But thanks for watching and stay solar.